I am proud of the trust we have received, but I am also aware that others are disappointed. There is a large frustration in society, a fear of violence, concern about the economy. The world is very unsure, and the political polarization has been even bigger, even too big in Sweden.
We can now bring in Nicholas Michelsen, a reader in international relations at King's College London, who's an expert in transnational movements and populism. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. What, in your opinion, can help explain the rise of the far-right Sweden Democrats?
Good afternoon. Firstly, thanks very much for having me on. So look, I think one can see in the rise of the Sweden Democrats a pattern that we've seen repeated across multiple countries, both in Europe and internationally. These are movements that articulate quite a clear account of what they see as the purpose of the nation. And it's not necessarily a particularly attractive account, but it's one that has traction within the population. They see the purpose of the country and of the national community as protecting a set of cultural identities, cultural characteristics that they see as under threat from a variety of external international processes. So the claim they make, the pitch to their population, and as was made very effectively by the Sweden Democrats, is that a large number of the problems faced within society, and you'll know that the debate within the election focused very much on crime and law and order, is sourced by essentially international presences, in this context, migration. And this has a long history within the Swedish context, going back to the very liberal and kind of generous approach it took to the Syrian refugee crisis in providing a kind of much more open door approach. And this has a particular story within the Swedish context, where this discourse of openness shifted towards a much more exclusionary, much more anxious discourse, which has been tapped into very effectively by the Sweden Democrats. So I think there are specific causes in the sense of the kind of national discourse around migration, but there's also a wider pattern, I think, of political movement here in which Sweden is reflecting. Maybe populism is a difficult word to use, but because it has kind of a variety of meanings, but that taps into a similar discourse about where the sources of the problems that states are faced by. And you see similar things going on in Italy, similar things going on in other places in Europe.
I want to talk about Italy because that's, of course, the next election we have coming up here in Europe, where the Brothers of Italy party, led by the far-right's Giorgia Meloni, is widely expected to take home a quarter of the vote. She could potentially become that country's next prime minister. What explains her appeal versus other far-right figures in Italy, like Matteo Salvini, for instance? And what is it about far-right parties that draw people in Italy? Could we also use the migration crisis? Is that one of the factors which Italy witnessed?
I mean, it's certainly one of the factors. I mean, there are some interesting correspondences, I think, between what's going on in Italy and what happened in Sweden. I mean, the links between Lega, which is Salvini's government, and of course, is that Lega was in a coalition government, which has obviously significantly weakened its appeal and allowed it to become somewhat entangled with some of in the national discourse with some of the things that have gone wrong. So Brothers of Italy has this kind of outsider status, which I think it's been quite effective at mobilizing. It is also a slightly more extreme party than Lega, and maybe that reflects the shifting nature of our times and the challenges that we're faced by, economic in particular, the energy crisis, inflation, and so forth. But I think certainly the language of immigration and also the language of jus solis, the idea of the particular rights that come to a national as a consequence of their location of birth. This provides this really important link between the two discourses in Italy and also in Sweden. Both of these parties are making an appeal to they're not making an appeal to race. I mean, they've sort of stepped around the racial links to both parties have neo-fascist roots at their beginning, but they've stepped quite consciously away from those links. And I think they've done so quite effectively. And one of the ways in which they've done that effectively is by talking in terms of culture. And that language of culture and the idea that if you're born here, you have a slightly better, easier access to culture. And these people coming from afar, they find it harder to make sense of our cultural norms. That is an argument that, whilst it's unattractive, it actually has traction within populations. And it allows them to explain a whole series of other often unrelated problems. So it allows them to explain economic challenges, inflation, and so forth.
Because one of the parties here in France, the National Rally, of course, have rebranded over the years, and they have become palatable to the local population who vote for them, and this is why we saw them make inroads into the National Assembly and Marine Le Pen do so well in the first round of the election. Is that what is going to happen now, that these far-right parties, including the Sweden Democrats, National Rally, Brothers of Italy, are just going to become a part of mainstream political parties here in Europe, and that's what it's going to be like?
Well, that's certainly something that should give us pause for concern. I think you can see a number of waves of new right movements. So a kind of series of waves that have their roots in the late 90s and the early 2000s. So you could think here of sort of the Tea Party movement in America. You could look at the Front National, the earlier iteration. Here you could look at the roots of the Brexit campaign. And then you see a second wave, as it were, of new right parties, which include the Brothers of Italy, but also sort of Vox and the shift in the National Rally. And I think what you can see here is new right parties really evolving, learning from their mistakes, developing the way in which they engage with their population, nuancing their message, particularly around questions of identity and culture, and also nuancing their message around international institutions, the role of the international, and what kind of vision they have for international relations, which has always been traditionally a weaker area for the new right. But actually, now they're increasingly centering their account of the world on the possibility of collaborating amongst each other. And this is something that I expect we will see more of going forward.
Nicholas Michelsen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you very much for having me.